In this video, I'm going to talk to you all about progress. We are going to examine what you should track for progress, how often, what's actually important, and what will give you the best indication of how you're doing. The fat loss industry in general has developed a rather unhealthy obsession with what you weigh being the primary metric to look at from a progress perspective. The trouble with this is what you weigh is made up of a lot more than just how much body fat you have and is very easily influenced by your environment, meaning it can fluctuate a lot, which isn't always going to give you the best indication of how you're doing. Yet for some reason, since the minute we drop out of a vagina, it's drummed into us that our weight is really important. And personally, I would argue that the minute you drop out of a vagina, that's probably the least important time to tell somebody how much their child weighs, because, well, from the mother's perspective, she probably wants to know A, what it is, boy or a girl, and B, most importantly, is it healthy? She probably doesn't care what it weighs because it's no longer inside her. She's no longer carrying it around. Yet, one of the first things a mother will be told upon the arrival of her beautiful miracle is what it weighs. And from that day on, our weight is used as a significant metric to measure our health. The health industry has a standard that they use to measure health called BMI, which is basically what you weigh versus your height and your age. And even that is inherently flawed because, again, our weight doesn't take into account the full picture of our body composition. For example, you could have two people. They could both be 25 years old. They could both be males. They could both be 6 foot tall. They could both be 15 stone. One of them could have a very low body fat percentage of around 6%. The other could have a very high body fat percentage of 25 to 30%. They would look incredibly different. And from a health perspective, one of them would have much higher risk of developing things like diabetes or heart disease. But their BMI score would probably be about the same, which is pretty fucked up. And this comes down to the fact that when you examine what makes up our weight, it isn't just how much fat we have, it's our bone density, it's the amount of water that we're holding, it's the amount of muscle that we hold, it's the amount of food in our digestive system, it takes into account our organs, and there's a number of things that can influence what we see on the scales. For example, if you eat more carbohydrates, or you eat more salt, or you just eat more food from one day to the next, you can see a spike on the scales that's got nothing to do with body fat. And yet, the majority of people not only primarily use their weight as their metric for success when they're trying to drop fat, they also attach quite an emotional connection to the number that they see, so that if there is a very natural fluctuation that isn't anything to do with body fat, they still beat themselves up and feel like shit. So when it comes to tracking our progress, I would say there's a number of factors that are a lot more important to look at to gauge whether you're doing a good job. The first thing I would look at is your measurements. I would take your chest, your waist, your hips, your thigh measurements, and I would monitor those every week or every 2 weeks. When you take them, I would do it first thing in the morning on a completely empty stomach to ensure that the conditions are as consistent as possible with as few variables that can alter the results you see. If you are becoming physically smaller and taking up less space on the planet on a weekly basis, that means you are dropping body fat and what you're doing is working, even if you're not seeing the scales move. And it is entirely possible to lose fat and not see the scales move and potentially even see them fluctuate up in the same way that it's possible to gain body fat and not see the scales move. So if you are witnessing your measurements dropping on a weekly basis or fortnightly basis, that is the biggest indicator that what you're doing is working. What you should also look at is progress photos. Compare side by side once a month to see, are you making progress in the areas that you're wanting to target? Looking at your progress photos once a month will give you more opportunity to see progress between photos. If you look at them every day or every week, you're probably not going to notice that much difference and you're going to feel frustrated. So if you can go a bit longer between looking at your photos, you are statistically more likely to see progress, and the more progress that you see, the happier you're going to feel. As well as this, it's worth paying attention to how your clothes fit. If your clothes are getting bigger and you've got more room in them, you're having to buy a smaller size, they fit you better, you feel like they look better on you, that is all way more important than what you see on the scales. Because again, if you're having to get smaller clothes because you're a smaller human being, it doesn't fucking matter what you weigh. You're dropping body fat and therefore making progress. You should also pay attention to what you physically see in the mirror. If you look leaner, if you like what you see more, if you're gaining more confidence, that is all way more important than what we see on the scales. Similarly, if people are making comments about how well you're doing and how good you look, even if you can't quite see it yourself yet, that is a much better indication than what you see on the scales. A question I like to ask every single person is, if I gave you the choice of being 10 kilos lighter than you are now and seeing very very little change in your overall physique, or being 10 kilos heavier than you are now with a physique you absolutely love, which option would you prefer? And each time I ask this question, I always get the same answer. The second option. People would much rather weigh more and look fantastic than weigh less and look shit. And that just emphasizes the fact that your weight isn't actually that important. Because if it was, if you just wanted to drop weight, you could cut a leg off and that would equate to a significant drop in weight. But since you're not doing that, you probably aren't that asked about what you actually weigh. You want to feel fitter, feel healthier, look better, and have more confidence. Other areas that constitute progress that gets overlooked is an improvement in your relationship with food. If you feel more in control, you're eating greater variety and more balance, you're getting more protein. That is all significant progress that again is way more important than what you weigh. Because if you're creating long-term behaviors that are going to create an environment for optimum health, for performance, that help you feel better and look better and ultimately succeed, that's a lot more important in the long run than dropping a bit of weight quickly on the scales. Equally, if you did want to drop weight quickly, you could just drink a gallon of prune juice, throw in some orange juice, a strong black coffee, and shit yourself into dropping a few pounds. It's got nothing to do with fat loss, but if all you want to do is see the needle move, that's a way you could go about it. The reality of the situation is, when it comes to tracking our progress, you want to look at your measurements every 1 to 2 weeks, your progress photos once a month, and probably look at your weight maybe once a month at most. By doing this, you are more likely to see steady and consistent progress that's less influenced by your environment and gives a more accurate indication of how you're doing. And let's face it, if you are seeing progress that makes you feel good, you're more likely to stick at what you're doing. So the less you look at the more volatile metrics that can fluctuate and give an inaccurate indication of how you're actually getting on, the more likely you are not to be pissing yourself off regularly. It's why, outside of all of that, pay really close attention to your behaviors, your habits, your routines that you're creating, and how your lifestyle changes over time. Because if you are more active, with a better relationship with food, you binge less, you enjoy including the food that you actually like, and you've just got an all-round healthier lifestyle whilst becoming a physically smaller human being, that is all way more important than what you see on the scales. When it comes to the speed of your progress, it's going to vary person to person. And a lot of people get a bit confused by the fact that if they're in a certain size deficit, the suggestion is that they'll lose a certain amount of weight per week. For example, a 500 calorie deficit should equate to about a pound per week. The thing to remember here is that that's not a guaranteed loss every single week. That's an indication that if you were to be in that size deficit for an extended period of time of say 6 months, the weight that you would lose in that period would equate to roughly an average of £1 per week. It could come off in big chunks every few weeks. It could come off consistently each week. You could have a massive drop right at the start and then nothing for a longer period of time and then another big drop. Each person is entirely different. We cannot control where we lose fat from or how fast it comes off, but what you can control is the underlying behaviors that create the environment for fat loss to occur. And by monitoring things like your measurements and looking at things like your weight a lot less, you're more likely to see your progress consistently, which is ultimately going to keep you feeling positive and like you're moving in the right direction. Spending all your time looking at the progress that other people are getting, or equally looking too frequently to see what progress you have made, is only going to leave you feeling frustrated. Not to mention, if you constantly compare where you are to where you want to be, you are likely to also feel frustrated. What we need to do is objectively look at the data. Look at your measurements at semi-regular intervals to make sure they're moving in the direction you want them to. Check things like your weight and your progress photos once a month, and make sure that every now and then, and not too often, you're looking at where you started versus where you are today, and not just analyzing what does your weight say, what do your photos look like, and what do your measurements say, but looking at your overall picture. What are your behavior patterns like? What's your routine and lifestyle like now? What's your relationship like with your progress, with your food, with activity? And as long as you can see progress in all those areas, that will give you the confidence to trust that what you're doing is working. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, give it a little like, and let's try and make sure that when you start looking at your own progress from now on, you're looking at the metrics that give you a much better indication of how you're doing.